Hello everyone, on today's episode we're going to be talking a little bit about why we undervalue ourselves and what we can do about correcting that so that we can improve our relationships. Today's episode is largely going to be inspired by The Undervalued Self by Elaine N, so I'll leave a link to that in the description and I'd recommend you guys check it out because it is a great read. So, once again we are going to be trying this on the racetrack to see if I can meet the challenge of discussing a complex topic while at the same time ripping through a Formula C race. So strap yourselves in and tighten those crash helmets, and let's dive right in, shall we? Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning into today's live drive. Today we're out here at Zolder in the Formula C, and we're going to try a couple of laps around in this quick sprint race and try to discuss some of the defenses we use against our undervalued self. So let's jump right in, and let's get off the line quickly here. I'm going to try to do this couple of laps all in one take and try not to screw this up too badly, so let's get it done. Alright, so a couple of the defenses that we use for, I guess, the protection of our self-worth in the face of the undervalued self. Starting up, we're going to be going with minimizing. Now, minimizing is where we often deny our own role in a situation in order to, I guess, protect our feelings of responsibility for the way we feel or maybe the way other people feel. Now, this is something that you probably want to avoid doing, especially if it is a situation you are responsible for. The next defense we use is blaming. Sorry about that. I blame that other guy for, I don't know, not braking appropriately or something. Anyway, I really should have just taken responsibility for crashing into the back of that other car, but it's much easier for my sense of self-worth if I simply blame the other driver. Now, one of the other things we can do to protect our sense of self-worth is to claim non-competition. Now, non-competition would be, say for example, I don't know, the way I perhaps never play any multiplayer on this, because I really feel it's easier to just play against the bots so I don't have to stack up my own sense of self-worth and driving skill against the real world. So I guess that might be one example of that. Now, the other option, if that doesn't work, you can try overachieving. Now, this has been mentioned in a few other recent YouTube videos I've watched where people are feeling that overachieving is now starting to become kind of a problem in their life. But you got to realize one of the things that we do to protect ourselves of self-worth is that... Whoa, what is this guy? Never mind. Yeah, so we overachieve as a way of guarding against feelings of perhaps worthlessness or loss of meaning. But again, overachieving can be a problem when nothing is ever good enough. You know, if you allow that sense of perfect to get in the way of good enough, then again, you're going to run into problems because you're never really going to find that sense of gratification in what it is that you've already achieved. So another thing we can do if if you want to go in the opposite direction would be inflating. So this would be, I guess, kind of akin to bragging, or I don't know, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. You've probably seen it or maybe even done it yourself where, you know, in a situation with a group of people, you know, a lot of people start throwing achievements around. Sometimes you feel that it's good to just maybe throw one in there as well. But afterwards, maybe you feel as if, you know, it didn't really give you that, you know, sense of gratification that you were looking for. Because sometimes what we'll do is overinflate our achievements in order to make our sense of self-worth, I guess, seem a little bit more inflated than it needs to be. And finally, the last defense mechanism is going to be projection. So if you have traits about yourself that are just so uncomfortable, often it's easier to just throw those onto other people, and often when they're not even there. So if you guys find yourself blaming people for stuff and other people are saying, hey, you kind of do that too, you may be projecting. So thanks for tuning into this quick live drive about some of the defenses we use to protect our sense of self-worth. So you may be wondering, why is it that we actually undervalue ourselves? What purpose could this possibly serve? Now, the good news is you're not alone. This is a very normal behavior, and it actually does serve an evolutionary purpose. Now, thousands of years ago, maintaining favor within a group could have meant the difference between life and death, and even though that isn't exactly our situation now, it does take quite a while for an organism of any kind, really, to evolve outside of those adaptations. So when you combine this innate tendency to undervalue with your personal history, you can create a kind of narrative in your mind that basically calls upon this undervalued self more so than it should be. So there are a few questions that you could ask yourself, including, do you have to please others in order to keep them happy at all costs? Do you ever feel like an imposter? Do you believe other people just aren't going to like you or what it is that you have to say? And, do you often lose before, you even begin? So these are really adaptations that may at this point be a little bit out of control, but the good news is there are ways of fixing it. So one of the important distinctions to understand when dealing with the repair of the undervalued self is the distinction between linking and ranking, and this is one of the somewhat two-dimensional ways that we can look at reality, especially with the relationships we have with other people, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But for right now, linking is really just the bonds that we draw from other people, and ranking is the process by which we measure our own self-worth against that of others. Now, there are ways to do this for a greater good, and there are ways to do this that will cause you harm. Now, this isn't exactly the same thing as things like love and altruism. These are slightly more distilled forms of linking, but linking in and of itself is something that is very important for any kind of a social species. So let's take a quick moment and define some of the terms that we are going to be using here. For example, overall self-worth, as the author describes it in this case, is going to be the sense of your capability to win in a confrontation, regardless of the specific abilities needed in that particular competition. So this isn't really going to refer to measuring your skill over somebody else. I mean, if it's something that's easily measurable, that may not apply in this case, but your overall self-worth is just that sense of your capability of victory. Your defeat response is going to be that tendency to respond to defeat with depression and shame, making it more likely you're just going to accept a low rank rather than continuing to compete. And finally, the undervalued self overall is that part of you that's going to develop the tendency to avoid defeats. So this is basically just a mechanism of protecting yourself from defeat. And if you've had a lot of them in the past, it's going to make it more likely that you're going to try to avoid them in the future. And the way we do this is often by ranking ourselves so low that we don't even bother being a contender of any sort. So what are some of the solutions proposed by the author? I remember back when I was in grade school, there was a huge push for this whole self-esteem culture, where the idea was you were supposed to just use ranking, I suppose, to just artificially inflate your sense of self-worth. But I've noticed this has really tended to cause a lot of people in my generation to eventually reach the real world, and it's really a lot worse than they had anticipated because they've never developed those necessary coping mechanisms. Now, this whole idea of raising your self-esteem is kind of a problem because it's still based on ranking. It really is nothing to do with creating links. So the author proposes that linking is really going to be the solution to healing this kind of undervalued self. So why is it that the self-esteem movement failed, and why is it that linking is going to be much more important? Well, in a lot of the experiments that the author cites here, the effect has largely been to, in fact, raise people's self-esteem when they go through this linking process anyway, and the reason cited is generally that fear of failure moves into the background when you're feeling connected rather than feeling judged. Now, when you're all about ranking, it's all judgment all the time because the only way to determine your self-worth is by reflecting off of other people, whereas ranking switched over to linking is going to have the effect of making people more open-minded. It's going to reduce prejudice, and that's largely because people, they're made artificially to feel inferior or superior. Their prejudice tends to report back as being above average than it would in, say, a control setting, and it makes people under stress more likely to seek help from other people rather than spending time blaming other people for the situation, and it finally moves people to helping people that they don't know, with less fear of being upset for just getting involved. So these are some great reasons why it might be a good idea to focus more on links you have with other people. So if you were, say, waiting in a group for an interview, it's, even though you may be competing with these people, it's often good to maybe strike up a conversation, because it'll move that fear of defeat into the background, and it'll make you open up and feel a little bit more natural. So thanks for taking the time to watch this episode of the Shredding Skeptic on the Undervalued Self. If this is a topic that interests you, I definitely recommend taking a look at the link in the description for the book, and you can pick it up on the Google Play Store. And definitely leave some comments below about what happens sometimes when you feel you are undervaluing yourself, and what do you do to get over that so that you can get back up on that horse and continue driving forward. And thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.